training video. Today we're talking about the LX7 mono channel, part 1. It's there's quite a bit to it, so we kind of split it up into two 15-minute videos. So today we're basically just looking at the sensitivity, the EQ, and a couple of other little things. Big thanks to Paul, Brandon, and Karen who helped me shoot this video. Karen did a lot of the video work. Paul and Brandon are helping make sure that I'm not missing things as I'm making the video. So big thank you to them. Have fun watching the video and let me know if I missed anything or if I'm leaving pieces out or if I'm not clear. Just send me an email or post in the Facebook group and I'll make sure to clarify that subject. So the channel strip that we're talking about today, we're going to look at channels 23 and 24. And the channels on the right hand side of the board are actually slightly different from the ones on the left side. And Paul brought up a good point. The difference being that there's a DIR pre button on the channels on the left hand side of the board, and that's short for direct pre. And so these channels on the back here have a direct output. So they're identical to these except that they also have that direct output. What that allows you to do is take a channel strip, it comes in, it goes to the board like usual, but then you can use a direct out for recording or something. Okay. The direct pre button sets whether the direct output is pre or post fader, which means whether or not it's affected by the level you're setting by this fader.
Okay.
So for example, if you want to record the input signal, you would press this button, and that means that the input signal goes out of the direct pre without being affected by the channel strip. However, if you want it to be affected by this level and the EQ and everything, then you leave it post.
Okay.
And then if this is all the way down, you won't get any signal out of the direct pre. Right. So the first thing on the top of all of the channel strips is the sensitivity or gain. It's called sensitivity on this board, but a lot of boards call it gain. And it basically sets how much of the input signal gets routed through the board. So this allows you to make sure that you're not doing a lot of different changes with the faders because your input signals are really different. So like a mic is going to come in and it's going to be a very low signal compared to a CD input or a keyboard or something like that. So you will bring the sensitivity up for a microphone, and that will allow you to use a signal that's approximately the same level throughout the rest of the board. So that's the first thing you want to do with the signal coming in, is set the sensitivity. To do that, you want to be able to see what the input signal is. So you click the pre-fader listen button. And what this does is, first of all, it routes the input signal out of the headphone. So if you're listening, you'll be able to hear just this channel strip. And it also lets these lights show the input level of that signal. So now if I turn the gain up, you can see I'm starting to get a little bit of level from that signal. So you can hit the pre-fader button to listen to and set the gain for this channel. And then when you bring the gain up, you start to see some level indicators on the mains here. So you want all of the gain to be approximately the same here. So for a mic to get, plus 4 dB, I might have to go up to, negative 40 sensitivity. But because the CD comes in pretty hot, I'm actually going to set it to around negative 20. And the goal here is to get it to around 0 on all of your channels. That's what you're going for. And what
so like on here?
So for if I pre-fader some of my other channels, I want to set the gain so that they're around 0.
Right.
And the reason for that is they might get considerably louder than that or quieter, but then you're approximately in the middle.
Yeah.
What you don't ever want to happen is you never want it to be up in the red because then it starts to clip and it'll sound distorted and problematic. So if someone's singing and they're around 0, that's good because then if they sing really loud for a second, they're still not going to clip.
Yeah.
So that's kind of you want to always aim for around 0 here. And that's basically it for the sensitivity.
So would the sensitivity be different according to the instruments? So like vocals would be, I see just looking at the settings right now, vocals seem to be higher, whereas the drums seem to be lower because the drums tend to clip easier because
Exactly.
Okay.
So you don't need to be as sensitive, you could say, to the drum channels because they're giving you more input signal anyways.
Okay.
So if we were to pre-fader all of these on a Sunday, they would probably all come out to around 0, even though the drums have a lower sensitivity because they're louder.
All right.
So is that the first thing you want to do when you come on the board is check the sensitivity?
Make
Yeah.
sure they're all set. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so every single Sunday morning, that's the first thing you do on all of the channels is make sure that your sensitivity is approximately, right? Most of them aren't going to change, but if a different vocalist is on a different channel, they're going to definitely have different sensitivities.
Okay.
But like typically bass or electric or acoustic shouldn't change that much from Sunday to Sunday.
Okay.
So right next to the sensitivity knob, there is a button that says 100 hertz. And what this is a high-pass filter for this channel strip. So what it does is it cuts off 18 decibels per octave below 100 hertz. So basically you have a mic that comes in, and when somebody breathes on a microphone, or if you've ever tapped a microphone, you generate a lot of very low frequencies that are actually really loud. And so what that comes out as is usually like a pop through the system. And so on things like microphones, we always turn this on because typically the human voice isn't going to generate much below 100 hertz. And so what that does is if someone accidentally breathes in the mic or hits it or something, you don't get this really loud pop that comes through the system.
Okay.
And Paul noticed that it's selected on the snare, and the reason for that is because the snare is a pretty high frequency instrument, and we really don't want the kick drum bleeding through here. The kick drum is going to generate a lot of frequencies below 100 hertz. So I put that cut on there so that I'm isolating the snare a little bit by cutting out all of those lower frequencies. Okay. So it's basically a special kind of EQ that they put on as a switch because you typically either want it on, you really want to cut all of those low frequencies, or you don't want it at all. Like for example, you're never going to put that on a bass because a bass generates a lot of frequencies you want that are below 100 hertz. Okay. So that's the high-pass filter switch that you get on every channel. Below that is the EQ for that channel. So we have a 4-band EQ with 2 sweepable mids on every channel. And then under the EQ, there's a switch to turn the EQ for that channel on and off. Okay. So if that's actually really helpful if you're EQing a channel and you're not sure if it sounds better than the original, you just click that and you're going to hear the original signal, and then you can hear what changes you're making by turning the EQ on.
So you have the EQ on everything, obviously. Yeah. You want to always on, right? Yeah.
Basically.
Okay.
And so the settings here, everything's pointing straight up, which means we're not making any changes to the signal at all, because the way each of the bands work is you can either boost or cut a frequency. So basically there's a high frequency, a high mid, a low mid, and a low frequency. So the high frequency and the low frequency are basically your bass and treble. Okay. And they're centered at a specific frequency, which I should know because it's in the manual, but I don't know what it is. I think the high frequency, my guess is that it's probably around like 20 kilohertz. It's like extremely high frequency. The low frequency is probably around 50 hertz or something like that. And so what the white knobs on here let you do is either turn that frequency and frequencies around it up or turn them down. Okay. So for example, if you're working with a voice and you're not hearing enough of the S's or the T's, for example, then you can turn this up because S's and T's are approximately in that range, and that's actually going to boost just those frequencies.
I'm learning something.
Now, the way the cuts and boosts work is they are basically a bell curve. So you have the frequency like this, and say where my fingers touch is around 20 kilohertz, and I turn it up. I'm really turning it up along with frequencies around it. So it's not like I'm only turning up one specific frequency, I'm affecting a range of frequencies. Okay. And that's called the Q size. So on our EQ here, we have a fixed Q size, so we don't really know how much of the frequencies we're affecting, but some boards have a selectable Q or a sweepable Q where you can either make it very narrow if you want to affect only like a very specific frequency, or wide if you want to turn kind of everything up a little bit. So that's basically what all of the white knobs do, is they either cut or boost a frequency or range of frequencies.
So if I turn to the left, it'll cut it, and then to the right will boost it.
Yeah, so it says here like negative on this side and positive on this side in decibels. So you can go up to 15 dB up or down to 15 dB below.
The top one is treble, the bottom one's bass,
right.
And this one's mid?
This one's your high mid, and this one's your low mid.
High mid and low mid, okay.
That's treble.
But like I said, these are what we call sweepable mids. So there's also these knobs that have black on them. And what they allow you to do is select the frequency that you're adjusting in that mid. So you can see here it says around 3K, the bottom is 550 hertz, and the top is 13 kilohertz. Yeah. So what that allows you to do is get very specific control. So I can say, okay, I want to cut 600 hertz. So I select 600 hertz with my sweep, and then I cut it with this knob. So that gives you a lot more control than the high frequency and low frequency because you know exactly which frequency you're playing with.
So it targets a specific frequency you
And
want to
then
boost or cut.
Right.
Boost it.
Okay.
So it gives you a lot more control over what you're changing. And one of the really nice things about the sweeps is what you can do is cut, say, for example, and then sweep through the frequency range, and you'll hear the difference. And you'll be able to tell which frequencies you're listening to. So, for example, say there's a voice that's coming through, and it just doesn't sound right. You know that there's too much of a frequency, but you don't know which frequency. You can just, cut it, and then try to find the frequency by sweeping the mid through the different ranges.
And then from there you can adjust if you want to.
Yeah, less or more.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So to demonstrate that, we have the gain set for this. So that's the unaffected signal, basically.
Okay.
So what we can do is boost the treble, cut the treble, and so that's what that frequency sounds like, right? So now we can boost the lows, or cut the lows, right? And so you start to learn what those frequencies sound like. Now the way these mids work, so say I boost, right now I have this set on 3 kilohertz, and then I can sweep, so listen really close.
It's like a wah.
Yeah.
It is a wah, that's how wah works. But so what I'm doing is I'm boosting a frequency, and then I'm changing, so it's like I have this curve on my equalizer, and I'm moving that curve
To where you want
to
it.
where I want it.
Yeah.
So
Is that affecting the note though?
No, I don't think so.
it's not affecting the note, it's affecting the volume of notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, if you said the cymbals were a note, what I'm doing is turning that note up or down,
Okay.
depending on what I want.
Right.
Because it is a note, technically. It's not a note you can play on a keyboard because a keyboard doesn't have that range.
Yeah.
But it is a
So
note.
you specifically change not the volume, but the frequencies, the name of the note.
No, you're changing the volume of either the frequency or note.
Okay.
Note and frequency are basically
same thing.
synonyms.
Okay.
Frequency is just, it's the cycles per second of that
It's
note.
just a measurement, kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay.
exactly. It's like a note is a certain frequency, you could say.
Okay.
Just like blue light has a certain frequency that's different from
Right,
green, an A note has a different frequency from a B note.
Okay.
So that's how the frequency works, or the EQ works, I should say. And it's really, this more than anything else is more practice than memorization. Most of the things on the board you can memorize how they work and then you just use them. EQ, you really have to be able to hear the frequencies that you want. And so, for example, the better you get, you'll be listening to a vocalist or something and you'll actually know, okay, I want to hear less of 800 hertz. And you know that without playing with anything, you just know what 800 hertz sounds like. So that takes a lot of practice and just playing with it before you really get to learn what the different frequencies sound like. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the EQ.
That's the EQ. Okay, so that's the video for this week. Just to recap, our key terms were sensitivity, pre-fader, high-pass filter, EQ, and the EQ-Q. So if any of those terms don't sound familiar, you might want to just skim back quickly through the video, look for that key term definition, and make sure that you have an idea what we're talking about there. Auxiliary outputs, they're called. And auxiliary just means extra. You can kind of use them for whatever you want.
Okay.
But every single mono channel can be routed through those auxiliary outputs. And this section is how you set up whether or not they're routed and how they're routed. So basically, this knob sets the volume for this channel for auxiliary 1. And this one,
Which is a monitor, right?
Yeah.
well, auxiliary outputs aren't necessarily monitor outputs, and I'll talk about what we use our auxiliaries for. The first three we do use for monitors. So basically, auxiliary 1, 2, and 3 go to amplifiers that go to the stage and power speakers. But then auxiliaries 5 and 6, 5 is used for effects, and 6 is used for our recording. So you can use them for whatever you want, but yeah, typically monitors is the main thing. So, for example, if I wanted to hear this channel in the in auxiliary 1, I would just turn this up.
Then you would hear it from that separate. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and because our monitors are on, turning that up actually sends it out to the monitors.
Okay.
So it's separate. No.
Yeah, so it's totally separate from all of these faders. So even though all these faders are off, I can still get my monitors.
Right.
However, it's not separate from the mute.
Yeah.
So the mute button for every channel affects the auxiliaries.
Okay.
Or you could say that the auxiliaries are post-mute because their level is affected by the mute.
Okay.
If they were pre-mute, then this would work regardless of what your mute was. And another example of pre-post is this switch here, which basically sets whether this level is pre or post fader. So if I have it set to pre-fader, then that means that I can turn this up and I'll hear it even though my fader's off.
Right.
Yeah.
If it's post-fader,
You have to have.
then I have to turn the fader up.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of different reasons why you might use pre or post fader. For monitors, you typically want all of your instruments and everything to be pre-fader. The reason for that is you don't want the mix out there to affect what they're hearing on stage. They know how much vocals and whatever they want to hear. And they don't want, for example, if you have to turn one of the vocals up or down, they don't want you to be affecting what they're hearing on the monitor. However, for a recording, which we use auxiliary 6, we set it to post. We leave the switch up. And the reason for that is we do want the recording to be affected by the mix that we're doing out here.
So okay. So what you're hearing out of the speaker is what you'll hear in the recording, is what you're saying.
Approximately, except that because we're using an auxiliary, we can set a relative level. So even though it's going to be affected by the fader, we can still have, for example, the handheld be a lot louder than the drums are in the recording. And that's because we want to make sure if you can hear anything that you can hear the handheld in the recording. We don't want it to be overwhelmed by the instrumentation. So even though it is affected by the fader, it's still always going to be louder than the drums.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So auxiliaries 1, 2, 3, and 4 both have pre-post switches. 5 and 6 on this board are hardwired to be post-fader. So you don't even have an option there. They're
So
just
that's why.
always
Okay, I
post-fader.
guess it's a good thing.
So that's why we use that. Make sense?
Yeah.
Auxiliaries are pretty easy. So typically on a Sunday morning, that's where you're focusing your time during practice. People are asking for monitor changers, more or less of something, and all you're doing is adjusting the level of that channel in that specific auxiliary. So we're going to skip pan and we're going to go down to the routing for the channel. So for each channel, there are 4 buttons underneath the mute that set where you're routing the main output of this channel. Now these buttons don't affect your auxiliaries at all. The auxiliaries are going to be totally separate from this routing. But we have a mono button, a mix button, a 1, 2, and a 3, 4 button. And that's for the mono main bus and then the 3 stereo buses. So I can basically tell this channel, I want it to go directly to my mono bus. And that's going to route it into this channel, basically.
All right.
And then if I turn this up, wherever this is routed is going to be affected. So right now we have the mono bus hooked up to our main speakers. So if I don't have this routed at all and I turn it up, nothing happens.
Right.
If I have it routed to mono, but this fader's down, nothing happens. But if I'm routed to mono and I turn both of these faders up, it's going to come out through our main mix because the mono output on this board goes to a crossover, then a set of amplifiers that power our main speakers. So that's what happens if I route it to mono. Now there's also a mix button. So I can route this to mix, and then if I turn this fader up and this fader, it does the same thing because we've selected that we're sending the mix bus into the mono bus.
Yeah.
So this won't do anything.
You have to have them both up.
This will. So they both have to go at the same time.
Because I'm routed through mix.
Okay.
So I'm routed to mix, but right now there is a left-right output for the mix bus, but we're not using it for anything.
Right. So we only have one speaker.
Because we only have a mono set of speakers, basically. But what I've selected is that the mix goes to mono. Because if you watch these routings here, basically the subgroups, we've set them to mix. Both of them are going into the mix. But then we also want the mix to go to mono because we're using the mono. So you end up with a lot of master faders, which is pretty typical on a setup like this. But if I wanted to skip all those, I could send it straight to the mono bus, and then even if all these are down here, I can still get output out of my mono bus.
Okay. But we don't usually set that on Sunday.
Yeah.
We do use the mono bus, as you can see, for a few of them. For example, effects, I send them straight to mono because I don't really see a reason for putting them in a subgroup.
Okay.
But the subgroups are handy because they allow you to control a group of instruments or vocals or something all at once. Because we use a mono output, we don't really take advantage of the fact that these are stereo buses if we just use them as a single bus. So for example, if I set this to 1, 2 and turn it up, then I have to turn 1, 2 up, both of them.
And the mono?
And I have to turn, well, mono's not going to do anything because these are just going to mix.
Oh, okay.
So I have to turn mix up as well. And now I have an output.
But if this one's down, it won't work.
Right.
Yeah, you need mono output.
You always need the main. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
However, because this is a stereo bus and we're only using a mono output, I can pan this to select whether I want to go into 1 or 2 because it's a mono channel anyway. So for example, if I set this all the way to left, I'm really selecting subgroup 1. So now I can turn 2 all the way down, turn my,
up. Yeah, okay, yeah.
and now I'll get an output. So yeah, if I have this set to subgroup 1, 2, and I pan it all the way to the right, I'm not going to get any signal unless I turn 2 up.
Okay.
And it even shows there too.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep, so
individual bar,
this shows you
yeah.
the 1, 2, and 3, 4 group levels for the outputs.
Yeah.
So what we have set up here is we've actually utilized the fact that these are stereo buses and we're only using a mono output. And we have all of our instruments panned to select the subgroup we want. So all of the drums are only in subgroup 1, all of the instruments are in 2, and all the vocals go in 3.
I think
And 4 is not being used.
4 is not being used. And so the way we do that is we select, for example, on the drums, we select subgroups 1, 2, and pan them to the left, which means we're using 1. So obviously if we had any real stereo instruments, like if we had a stereo synth and a stereo speaker setup, this wouldn't work as well because we would lose all the stereo effects. They would all end up
in one.
coming out of both speakers, basically. So we might not want to do that all the time, but in this case it's convenient because we can utilize these as 4 separate subgroups instead of 2 stereo subgroups, basically. So that's how the routing and the pan works together. And now if we had selected mix, the pan is really setting how much comes out of the left output and how much of the right output of the main output. So the main, as opposed to the mono, has 2 outputs on the back of the board. And so in that case, your pan is really selecting whether it's coming through left or right. So the key terms for this week were auxiliary output, pre-post, bus, and pan. So make sure that you remember those terms. If you don't remember them, check out the LX7 user guide and all the information should be in there. Now I'm going to talk about the master section. So we already talked about the individual channel strips and how this works. But then there's a section here that's kind of different. But most of it works kind of along with this. We already really talked about the main routing and how that works. But above that, there is auxiliary masters. So just like we were routing this to mix and mono and the subgroups, and then we were controlling those master faders here, the auxiliaries have masters. So for example, if I have auxiliary 1 master all the way off, then turning this auxiliary 1 isn't going to do anything because I'm cutting this signal all the way. So now I have to turn this up before I'll hear anything on the stage. Right. Pretty simple. Now there's also AFL, which means after fader listen buttons here. And so if I push this signal gets routed through the monitoring bus. So you're going to start seeing lights here that indicate the level of this bus. And you're also able to listen to the bus through the headphones. So now if I turn this up, start seeing lights show up here, and you'd be able to hear that in the headphones.
Okay.
Which the after fader listen is actually a really good tool for monitor that I don't take advantage of nearly enough. But oftentimes you want to, before maybe making a change that one of the musicians is requesting, you want to listen to what the overall mix sounds like. And so what you can do is hit after fader listen on that monitor, listen to it with the headphones, and what you're listening for is typically musicians are going to ask for something to be turned up. They rarely ask for something to be turned down. But oftentimes, the reason they're asking for it to be turned up is because they can't hear it, and that's because something else is too loud, really. but oftentimes they don't necessarily know that. They know they can't hear acoustic guitar, but they don't realize it's because the drums are way too loud.
Right.
And so the after fader listen is a quick way to go, oh wow, you know, some vocalist perhaps is like way louder than everyone else, and they don't realize that that's why they can't hear anything else on stage.
So it helps you fix the problem, and then
Yeah, exactly.
instead of just turning the volumes up, you can be like, oh, well, I can turn this down, and that
You
way
always want to turn something down if you can instead of turning something else up,
Yeah.
which is actually also a principle with the EQ. Usually you want to cut before you boost, because you have to remember that if you boost a signal here, you're actually playing with this input volume. So say you were close to clipping, and then you're boosting one of the frequency ranges a whole bunch, you can actually end up overdriving the whole channel, even though your input gain is set to a point where it looks okay. So you gotta typically try to cut frequency ranges before you boost them. So if you can't hear enough definition in a voice, maybe the answer is to boost 3 kilohertz, but it might actually be to cut 400 hertz and take some of the muffled sound away. So keep that in mind there, and also whenever you're mixing the monitors too. So above the auxiliary master knobs, there are 2 stereo channels that are basically compressed versions of these channels. So same idea, they have inputs on the back, you have a sensitivity or gain for that channel here, you have a 2-band equalizer, so all you basically have is treble and bass. And I think the reason they do that, besides saving space, is you're typically running a CD or something that really shouldn't need much EQ, so they compress that down. Then you have 2 knobs for auxiliaries, and they control either output to auxiliaries 1 and 2, or if you click this switch, then it's 3 and 4. So you can only route these through 4 auxiliary buses, and you can only do 2 at a time. So again, they've kind of limited you because they're probably expecting you to use a CD or something that you don't need to send to monitors anyways. Then there's a level for the main. So this knob is basically the equivalent to this fader. So again, you have routing buttons. Here they're simplified though. Down, if this button is pressed, it means you're going to mix. If it's not pressed, you're going to subgroup 1, 2 for this channel. On this channel, if it's not pressed, you're going through subgroups 3, 4. So your routing is much more limited, but again, typically you don't need that much in this case.
You just go straight to the mix.
Yeah, in this case, we're just going to the mix, and then you can control the level of this channel in the mix bus by turning this rotary. And then they also have pre-fader buttons, just like these, for setting the level or listening to the signal before you route it
through.
Yeah, so pretty simple, almost identical to these, just compressed. On the right-hand side, there is a phantom power button, which is used to power condenser microphones and active DIs and things like that on stage. So what this switch actually does is puts 48 volts on all of the mic inputs on the back. So it actually sends quite a bit of electricity to the stage to power things like microphones. So for example, the microphone we're using for recording, a condenser microphone, requires phantom power because it's a condenser microphone.
It doesn't have a battery in it.
Exactly. Now, most of the microphones we use, like the SM58s for vocals or 57s for instruments, are dynamic microphones, and they don't require phantom power. So this board has one global switch that turns it on and off, but a lot of boards have individual switches because typically it's bad principle to send phantom power to a device that doesn't require it because you're actually putting extra voltage.
Which we're doing all of our stuff right now.
Yeah.
Not the best.
It's not the best, but SM57s and 58s are designed to be used that way, so it's not a big deal. There are some things that you'll destroy if you do this. For example, if you miswire these and hook up like a guitar or something, you'll destroy the guitar by sending phantom power to it. Or if you have these routed in such a way that they actually are going into a device that has phantom power, you can destroy the device or you can destroy the channel strip on this board because you're actually sending quite a bit of voltage now. Additionally, it also means that if ever there was a short circuit, someone could get electrocuted. So like you've seen, like anytime we baptize people, they're like really careful with the mic, and that's because we're sending a whole bunch of electricity. Because this is making a huge change to the electricity, it makes a really loud noise if you turn it on and off while the amps are on. So you never want to adjust. You never want to press or unpress this button while this is hooked up to amplifiers of any kind.
would you want to shut the amplifiers down first? Or?
Yeah, you definitely want any amplifiers that this board's hooked up to be off before you press this button.
So you turn those off, return them back.
Yep.
You turn that on, and then you turn those back on.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. So that's phantom power. We use it, all of our DIs on the stage, direct boxes, which I'll talk about some other time, are active DIs, which means they require either 48 volts to be on the line or they require a battery.
Okay.
And batteries are a pain, so.
We just power it through the board.
Yeah.
Same with the condenser mics for the piano.
Yeah.
Yep, condenser mics on the piano. There's a condenser mic in the drums. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a couple things. Underneath that, there is a talkback level and routing for a talkback mic. And basically, what this is you can hook up a microphone to the board directly here,
So you can,
and then you can talk to the auxiliary outputs or the main output. So I can hold this button, and then anything I'm putting into this input just goes to the auxiliaries. So you can use it to talk to the musicians on the stage.
It's like a walkie-talkie.
Exactly.
Cool.
It can be really convenient if
if you're far away.
yeah, you're far away, or if you have an electric guitarist that just will not quit playing and you don't feel like yelling over him. Then there are two stereo returns that we're not currently using, but they're kind of like a very compressed channel. So they're actually inputs on the back, and all you do is set the level on the mix bus. So this always gets routed to the mix bus. There's no option, and this just sets the level. So for example, one thing you could use this for is for an effects return. So like right now we route all the effects out an auxiliary, but then once that signal's processed, it has to come back in the board somewhere. We currently put it on a regular channel strip, which gives us full EQ control and routing and all of that stuff,
Okay.
and then a main level. This could be used for that. It expects a line level, so you don't even have to set a gain. You just turn it up or down, and it only goes through the mix. So it's basically just a really, really simple stereo channel. Underneath that, there is a 2-track level and a button to use the 2-track. So basically, this is another stereo channel, but what it's designed to be used for is something that totally replaces the mix bus. So if you push this, anything that's coming in the 2-track input will go straight to mix, and all of the rest of the routing gets turned off.
Oh.
So what they recommend you use this for is if you have like a CD or something, you can run it in here, press this button for like pre-service CD or something, and then anything else you do will not affect what you're hearing out of the mix bus. This is the only thing that's going to be sent out. So it's actually a little bit dangerous, because if you press this button during a service, everything is going to go off.
Okay.
So that's why there's a caution symbol here, and it says replaces mix output.
So we use this on a Sunday morning.
We actually don't use this. We
You don't
run
use
we run like our CD and stuff through this channel strip, which gives us a little bit more control. And I don't like this because it's risky, and you can't do a smooth transition. It's like all or nothing. So if you wanted to fade a CD in, you can't really do that because you're cutting off everything else, and then you're turning it up.
Okay.
So we don't use it right now. It's kind of limited, but it's there in case you need it. Underneath that are a bunch of monitoring buttons. So this set of LEDs here is controlled by either the pre-fader, if you have it selected, and if you have it selected, then this light shows up, which lets you know if you have a button pressed somewhere else that this has this. And another thing is that you can pre-fader multiple instruments at a time, and they'll all get routed through this monitoring bus, basically. But when you're not pre-fadering, you can hit mix or 1, 2, or 3, 4 to listen to just the subgroups or just the mix bus if you want to, or the mono or 2-track. And then there's a phones level, which just sets the level of the headphone output on the mixer.
Okay.
And that's basically the entire master section. So as far as on top of the board, that's basically it. There's lots of stuff on the back, but that's it.